Hello and welcome to week 12, getting ever closer to the end of the course and ever closer to modern times. As you've noticed already with the PowerPoints, a lot of what I keep trying to do is build you into how these things are still affecting us today. And certainly World War II and its subsequent Cold War very much still affect us today. So I want to start here then with what exactly the Cold War was. Now, obviously, I'm missing a lot with World War II. The foundations for the Cold War were laid even earlier than that, going all the way back to the end of World War I, when at the end of the war, the United States, Britain, and France put troops on the ground, diverted troops that had been fighting on the Eastern Front into Russia itself, effectively participating in what was a civil war in Russia, using militarily active troops that had been in World War I to fight the Red Army in hopes of overturning Bolshevik control. And not surprisingly, the Bolsheviks took that personally, as one would expect. Lenin himself, who would die soon thereafter, 1924, left the Soviet Union open effectively for Stalin to take control. Now, to be fair, of course, to Lenin, he didn't have any expectation that things wouldn't operate the way he had planned for. His assumption was that his first lieutenant Trotsky would end up being the next leader in the Soviet Union. But unfortunately, Trotsky was away at the time that Lenin died, and Stalin took the opportunity to gather in an effectively Byzantine way alliances of other leaders of the Bolsheviks to him and to keep Trotsky out of power. And in this way managed to take control and to create the totalitarian state that we discussed last week in the Soviet Union. Going into World War II, though, Stalin had solidified his totalitarian control, was attempting through a series of collectivization plans to create a very strong Soviet Union, one that could stand against the West. So his idea that he couldn't trust the West was already in place. This is going to grow during World War II itself, especially, well, starting in 1939, when he signs the Mutual Non-Aggression Pact with Hitler, with the plan at that point in time effectively to build the Red Army even more strongly. He knew he was going to come up against Hitler eventually, so the non-aggression pact was designed literally to give him the time to prepare for that, but it also then meant that it was Britain and France fighting Hitler alone during that period, which leads to distrust of Stalin. So this is a mutual thing. The acrimony between the USSR and even the Allies during World War II was intense. The numbers of meetings that were had between Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin were never completely friendly. There were attempts to be friendly, and of course, the pattern of how they were going to build the world after World War II was already in place, and we'll talk about that again in a moment. More interestingly, though, is that while all of that's going on, the atomic age is being created. One of the interesting ironies, of course, is that most of the physics experts who will figure out how to split the atom were actually German, but due to Hitler's policy of anti-Semitism that started as early as 1936-37, when so many Jewish people were already fleeing Germany, this would effectively lead many of these guys who could figure out how to do it to the United States. Where Albert Einstein, who had fled Germany as soon as Hitler was elected as the chancellor, had already taken up a position as a teacher in the United States at Princeton. He would become one of the first people that many of the fleeing former German physicists would encounter. And while he himself was a pacifist and did not have any desire to work on nuclear energy or on building any kind of nuclear weapon, he was the one who would send the letters to FDR, basically trying to warn him that Hitler was working on this program. It would take a while due to the FBI's, particularly Hoover's, fear of Einstein, because not only was he a pacifist, but he was also an active socialist, and he was also um, a Zionist who believed in the need to create a independent nation for the Jewish people. All of these things made the FBI distrust him intensely and to run interference for a long time on these letters so that Roosevelt wouldn't see them. But eventually, when Roosevelt did, he took it upon himself to create a similar program in the United States. And we refer to this program as, of course, the Manhattan Project. Very covert. There were three actual different areas of the United States where the different parts of the bomb were being developed, experimented with, and so forth. And it wouldn't be until literally 1945 that all of the component parts were brought together in Mexico, New Mexico, White Sands, in order to develop this. It also, while Roosevelt knew about it, Roosevelt dies before it's actually completed or tested, effectively putting it in the hands of Truman, who was the vice president under Roosevelt and who would become president at his death, to actually have to deal with the decision to use it and the consequences thereof. So by that point in time, again, Germany would surrender in April of 1945 when the Red Army makes it all the way to Berlin and surrounds the bunker. Hitler and all of the remaining leaders of the Nazi Party committed mass suicide in order to prevent having to be held accountable for the war and the consequences. Japan, however, would not surrender. And a big part of this was because the United States demanded unconditional surrender, which would have effectively dismantled Japanese society. In Japan itself, the people were very much dedicated to the emperor, considering him to be divine, and most of the people in charge in Japan believed that this was absolutely not what they would do. They offered numerous times to surrender, but not unconditionally. They wanted to retain their form of government and many of their ideas. And they knew that the United States and NATO would not allow this. So instead, they opted for effectively what we would consider to be national suicide. Um, from the United States perspective, by the time this started, it was clear that Japan was nowhere near being able to continue to fight the war. Most of their military was gone, their navy was gone. They were down to literally using civilian ships and civilians in every capacity to continue the fight. But it was becoming cost extravagant for the United States to continue to fight the war. And most of this was because of the casualty figures that were coming due to the policy of island hopping, the fact that the U.S. and the allies that were still fighting, particularly in the South Pacific, were having to literally go island to island to ferret out Japanese soldiers. And it was becoming quite costly in terms of lives and casualty figures. So this would lead Truman to decide ultimately that in lieu of trying to invade Japan itself, which could have been exorbitant in the number of lives lost, to use the nuclear weapons. Now, at this point in time, they had only been tested the one time, and it was extremely successful. But they didn't have any working knowledge of what the long-term effects would be. I encourage you to look at the Atomic Age PowerPoint in week 11. Which was one I put together a while back with firsthand accounts from survivors of the two nuclear blasts in Japan at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and as to exactly what happened also in the aftermath and what nuclear war was actually like in this period. And again, I encourage you to look at this because we still are combating issues having to do with nuclear war and, of course, the recent, once again, threat of nuclear weapons being used. So we'll come to that towards the end of this with the new Cold War effectively between the West and Russia and the West and China. But at this point in time, yes, the first use of nuclear weapons would usher in the atomic age, and for a short period of time, from effectively 1945 to 1948, U.S. preeminence in the world because of the possession of nuclear bombs, but also the sudden awareness of what that actually means. So again, the atomic age PowerPoint, I encourage you to look at it as it will discuss that. All right. So the ushering in of the Cold War, very much active as soon as the U.S. uses nuclear weapons. But again, the Cold War also having started earlier with tensions between the U.S. and the rest of the Western world, as it were, the USSR and the rest of the Western world, and the agreement that was made early on in World War II when the Allies were trying to keep Stalin fighting with them, to the agreement that whoever controlled territory that had previously been held by Germany during World War II would help to determine the types of governments that those nations or those areas would have. With that in mind, of course, it became by 1945 a race between the Red Army and the armies of the United States, Britain, and France to take control of different parts of um, former German territories in Europe to see who would be able to determine what kind of governments they would have. Now, all had agreed that they would be democratic governments where the people of those areas would be able to elect in theoretically open elections who they wanted as their leaders and as their forms of government. But Stalin would use the KGB to effectively give communist parties in the areas he controlled the actual power to create communist governments. So this is a big part of what's going to happen. And again, Churchill and FDR had agreed, knowing this was effectively what was going to happen, mostly to keep Stalin fighting, to keep the USSR from withdrawing from the war and leading to Germany's ability to control the rest of Europe. So as of the end of the war, we have what I refer to as the bipolar world. You effectively have the United States and its allies who would go on to create NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, still extant today. And you would have the Soviet Union controlling satellite nations that it referred to as buffer states between the USSR and Western Europe. Most of these would become members of what would be called the Warsaw Pact, which would be the Soviet Union's response to the creation of NATO. Throughout the Cold War, there would be numerous events that would lead to conflict indirectly between the United States and NATO and the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. I encourage you to pay close attention to all of these things. Probably the most well-known incident that almost led to direct military and nuclear conflict was, of course, the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1963. It would ultimately be resolved by the United States and the USSR agreeing to withdraw nuclear weapons from areas close to each other. In this respect, the USSR agreed to remove nuclear weapons from Cuba in return for the United States removing nuclear weapons from Turkey. But again, that was literally the moment when the United States and the USSR and the world was waiting for actual nuclear war to happen between the two major players in the Cold War. I encourage you also to look here at History Hit for 8 near incidents that almost destroyed the world when it looked as if nuclear war was actually being launched or nuclear weapons were actually being used. So very critical things that happened in this period. And while we don't think of them much today, people at the time knew about them, and it was very, very scary, again, especially after looking at what nuclear war actually does. So many of you are going to tell me quite inaccurately that the Cold War was cold because there were no actual wars. No, there were a lot of wars and a lot of incidents. And there are a lot of people who lost their lives during the Cold War due to these conflicts. The distinction, though, is that the United States and the USSR never came to direct conflict, mostly because of the fear of nuclear weapons. But that doesn't mean that people didn't die. Here are a whole list of incidents. We think of the Vietnam War, the Korean War as being 2 of the main wars in which the United States and the USSR were actively involved. Mostly because while we weren't directly fighting each other, we were directly fighting each other. We were putting our troops on the ground in these areas to fight their troops on the ground, but we were using these proxy wars, as they're called, to keep from being directly involved with each other. Even though we still had troops on the ground, we were still militarily funding them, using our equipment or allowing these sides to use our equipment, um, calling our fighters advisors, military advisors, um, effectively in a war between what was considered to be Western style democracy and capitalism against Eastern style or Soviet style communism. And by this, what we mean politically is that it was totalitarianism, or at least dictatorial control. So again, that concept of communism, the ideal of communism, not practiced either in the Soviet Union or China or any of the other areas today that call themselves communist, but instead it's forms of totalitarianism. So I encourage you also for very thorough or more thorough discussions of these particular proxy wars and incidents to look at the 3 PowerPoints that I have in week 11 in the PowerPoint section, which I'll show you in just a moment. They give you literally chronological listings of incidents between the US and the USSR, or incidents in which the US and the USSR were fighting Cold War fights against each other by using military forces and civil wars and insurrections in other nations to go about trying to win the Cold War. Again, don't tell me there were no deaths. Here is a chart from the Our World in Data site, which is a wonderful site that literally shows you all kinds of information and statistics about the world that we live in today and the world we have lived in the past 200-300 years. This particular chart, Cold War deaths, look at this. Millions and millions of people died in the Cold War. Many of them in the Middle East, not as many of them in the Americas, but some in the Americas. And when we talk about the Americas, we're mostly talking about Central and South America, where both the US and the USSR funded numerous civil wars and insurrections, leading to, again, millions of deaths. The big distinction is that we don't tend to think of them because we weren't fighting ourselves, even though our volunteer army today often was. So I encourage you, pay attention to this. The Cold War was a war in which many people died. All right, so the end of the first Cold War, starting effectively in the 1980s. At the time, many people saw the decline of the Soviet Union becoming more obvious with the failure of the Red Army in Afghanistan to take control. This should have been something we were paying attention to, since it pretty much is a demonstration of also why we lost the war in Afghanistan, making many of the same mistakes that the Soviets did. We did not learn from that. It was also, though, in that war that we created the Taliban. Under Carter, the U.S. Invested heavily in military aid and economic aid to the Taliban in hopes that they would be able to defeat or at least keep the Soviet Union from getting total control, which was good, except it also meant that we then helped to create the modern Taliban, which then became our enemy. So you got to be careful what you think will help. We also saw a decline with Gorbachev's policies of first détente and then perestroika, both attempts on the part of the then leader of the USSR, the last leader of the USSR, to try to salvage what he could of the Soviet economy. But it was unfortunately too little too late. The Soviet Union would not be able to counter the popularity of, interestingly, Western society, particularly in the younger generations in the Soviet-controlled nations who were seeing a decline in their standard of living, while at the same time wanting many of the things that they saw youth culture in the West having. Rock and roll music, CD players, Walkmans, technology that allowed access to new forms of entertainment, new television shows, new fashions. All of these things were being leaked into Soviet-controlled areas because of the advancements in Western technology. And in fact, by the 1980s, by 1989, definitely, media, media broadcasts from radios that were managing to get past blocking technologies that the Soviets had, television shows that were being picked up and recorded, and then recordings, VHS recordings sold throughout the Soviet Union through the black markets. All of these were leading to massive declines in the Soviet economy as well. 1989 saw the beginnings of what would be called the Velvet Revolutions, as particularly those nations closer to Western Europe that had been controlled by the Soviet Union began to hold more open elections. The rise of democratic parties, resistance to Soviet control began to grow, and by 1989, some of these nations actually held open elections that saw communist parties lose. And the USSR not stepping in, not sending its army in to retain control as they had in the 1950s and 60s, thus leading these nations to break away from the Warsaw Pact and to become independent and to open up trade with the United States and with the West. By 1991, the Soviet Union itself was disintegrating as nations that had been part of the Soviet Union continued to do the same thing. And in fact, in 1991, Boris Yeltsin himself was elected as the new president of Russia, Russia becoming an independent state from the Soviet Union, thus leading to effectively the end of the First Cold War. Now, what we see after that, of course, would be Cold War 2.0. And some of, while it's, well, still debatable as to whether it's been officially declared for the most part, most journalists and most modern historians believe that, yes, we are already in a second Cold War. The 1990s and early 2000s saw a rise in prosperity throughout the world as a whole in the wake of the end of Cold War 1.0. Much of this was due to the emergence of modern digital technology, 2007 being a banner year as we saw the iPhone, Google, and a number of other digital services that we still have today come into play and to be wanted not only in the West but throughout the rest of the world. But this also then led to eventually the Great Recession, which also started in 2007, where the U.S. economy began to implode. And the consequences of that, as with the Great Depression in the 1930s, finding its way out into the rest of the world. It's led to increased tensions between the U.S. and its allies, particularly in NATO, but also tensions between non-NATO nations and the U.S., particularly with China and Russia. All three of us trying to balance national economies against globalism, right? China began effectively in the 1980s and 90s to move a little bit more into capitalism, particularly very heavily state-regulated capitalism, with the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, encouraging trade with the West and the capitalism necessary for that, but also closely monitoring it to make sure that anyone who was making tremendous amounts of money through trade with the West, that they were paying their fair share, as defined by the Chinese Communist Party, to the government itself. There are also current tensions between the United States and China over Taiwan, which the United States has recognized as an independent nation since the Chinese Civil War ended, but which the CCP recognizes only as being a basically rebellious area of communist China. So some tensions, and you'll see this if you're looking at the news today, because U.S. political leaders still keep making trips to Taiwan, Nancy Pelosi recently, Kevin McCarthy more recently, and the Chinese government basically saying that they see these trips, these discussions as being offensive to the Chinese government itself. There are also areas in the South China Sea that China has purportedly been trying to build up to create new land that China itself can control, basically to expand the size of China itself. But at the same time, these are incursions into what are considered to be international waters that the United States has effectively said, no, you can't do that, because these waters are open for trade for everyone in the South China Sea area, which would include Korea, Japan, and other areas that the United States has trade authority with. So a lot of tensions developing with China over Chinese attempts to control areas. More, though, with Cold War 2.0 has been, of course, the most recent Russia and Ukraine situation, the war that's been ongoing for over a year now due to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Putin, the current president of Russia, even though he's becoming, literally is a dictator more so than a democratically elected president, claims that Ukraine is actually Russian, that this idea that Ukraine is an independent nation is something that came out in World War II as a byproduct of Western interference in what was then the Soviet Union. That most people who live in the Ukraine actually see themselves as Russian, something that the Ukrainian government itself says is not true. There's some really good studies and books about this. The West, however, recognizes the Ukraine as being an independent nation. And in fact, one of the big points of contention has been, since the end of the Cold War, the Ukrainian application to be a member of NATO, which Russia sees as a direct threat. This threat has escalated particularly recently, since Finland has just recently been admitted as a NATO member. Finland, of course, having been a part of Russia itself as well, and certainly a part of the Soviet Union. So most NATO nations have been backing the Ukrainians with military, economic, and direct aid. Russia, Putin particularly sees this as a threat. And has recently escalated his rhetoric about the use of nuclear weapons, particularly in Ukraine, but also, if necessary, against anyone helping the Ukraine. So again, Cold War 2.0 definitely back on the table, particularly with reference to the threat of nuclear war. Putin has also met recently with Chinese President Xi. Xi has not actually taken a formal stance on the Ukrainian war. And some would argue is attempting to moderate tensions between Russia and the Ukraine, and thus Russia and the West, but many others particularly see this as being an attempt on Putin's part to ally with China. So a lot of tension, literally, in this situation. I bring you now to a quote from the Status of World Nuclear Forces from the Federation of Nuclear Scientists, who run the wonderful world clock, letting us know how close we are to doomsday, or again, the threat of nuclear war. In contrast to the overall inventory of nuclear weapons, the number of warheads in global military stockpiles, which comprises warheads assigned to operational forces, is increasing once again. The United States is still reducing its nuclear stockpile slowly. Most of these would be weapons that are actually now obsolete, or so old they need to be obsolete. France and Israel have relatively stable inventories, but China, India, North Korea, Pakistan, and the United Kingdom, as well as possibly Russia, are all thought to be increasing their stockpiles. And the reason for this, of course, would be because of the threat of nuclear war. The last image that I'm going to leave you with for this week is the current estimated global nuclear warhead inventory. And I would draw your attention to the United States and Russia, both of which have over 5,000 nuclear warheads in stock ready to be used, right? Compare that to the other 7 members of what is called the nuclear club, the nations of the world that currently have nuclear weapons. I would also point out that one of the other things at play in the world right now with this is Iran, who we have been working with and working against to try to end their development of nuclear weapons. More about that when we get into terrorism in the next 2 or 3 weeks. All right, so this is the state of how things are today, the whole idea that we're back in Cold War 2.0. In order to understand it, you really need to understand Cold War 1.0. And that will bring us then to our current discussions. I'm going to point out right now in week 11, totalitarianism in World War II, which was actually from last week. The place I'm going to bring you to are the timelines, because these are, even though we're talking week 12, these are in week 11. The Atomic Age PowerPoint in the Atomic Age folder. I encourage you to look at that. There are some other really good ones in here. Radiation effects from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This really good primary source analysis that shows, well, actually it's a film from 1946 that shows actual footage from after those bombings. Also further down here though, in the PowerPoints, these maps of the Cold War that I made up, these are the ones I was referring to that will actually show you the incidents and the events in the Cold War, including the Vietnam and Korean Wars, but other things as well. The CIA assassinations, the proxy wars, all of that are listed in these Cold War map sets. I encourage you to look at those. All right, and then from that, let's go and actually look at communism and the Cold War for this week. The question, the ideology of the Cold War conflict was between the idea of capitalism and democracy on one side and communism and economic equality on the other. The US and NATO and the USSR and the Warsaw Pact nations argued that their way of life was the best for people and that the other side was hypocritical and corrupt. And we see this on both sides. And of course, from our perspective in the West, it's easy to point to totalitarianism as not providing the equality or the freedoms that lifestyle under the democratic capitalist West did. Inversely, the US and NATO were accused of corruption by undermining democracy when they felt that that democracy would lead to alliances with socialism, of which there are many examples. Again, the assassination of Mossadegh in Iran being one of the absolute best. So, how were they both right and wrong? Well, I just gave you some potential answers to that. What was the practical issue for each side? That also I've given you. How serious was the threat of nuclear war and how did it drive changes in Cold War policy for both sides? Again, a lot of that best seen through what both sides do in the wake of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1963. How does the Cold War still affect us today? How does the threat of nuclear war affect us today and why? And again, all of these are things that I've addressed to some extent in the PowerPoint that I just showed you and which are more readily seen in a lot of the other sources that I brought to you for this week. All right, so again, your required readings and writings, Frankopan 20 and 21, Harari 18, but also decolonization, which I didn't talk a lot about, but which almost all of the proxy wars are caused by. I encourage you to look at the Cold War and decolonization, and also to look at Brian Toon's TED Talk effectively on nuclear war and why you should be worried about it. All right, recommended sources, other things that can help. What is neocolonialism, which will help you with the decolonization issue. Trent's Cold War and Decolonization, which is a really, really wonderful little thing there, as well as, of course, Crash Course, World History 40, Decolonization, and Nationalism Triumphant. So that should give you a head start on what you're looking at for this week's discussion. I look forward to reading your discussion posts, and if you have any questions, let me know.